Welcome back to Analysis. In the first half of the programme, we've been discussing the appointment of Peter Clarke, a former National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism, to oversee the probe into 25 Birmingham schools accused of forcing fundamentalist Islamist values onto pupils. Many believe his appointment is inappropriate and has the potential to inflame community relations. Sir Albert Bohr, leader of Birmingham City Council, who's been coordinating his own investigation into the Birmingham schools, said, "At first, the announcement of an independent commissioner is a missed opportunity to strengthen our coordinated approach to addressing these very serious matters. Peter Clarke will need to give careful consideration to building a strong relationship with us and, given his recent counter-terrorism responsibilities in London, ensure that his investigation does not undermine the confidence of our communities." As the investigations broaden to include schools in Bradford and Manchester, in this part of this programme, we'll be looking at the impact of these probes are having on the communities where they take place. In the studio with me, Dr. Tim Parsons is still with me. And then we're joined by Labour MP for Ladywood, Birmingham, Shabana Mahmood, and Professor Gus John from the Institute of Education, who's an education expert. On Skype, Alice Kermani, Director of STREET, the strategy to reach, empower and educate teenagers, also joins us. Gus, you were with us in this programme when we looked at this thing when it initially broke. Sure. Can you believe that we've gone from what is now regarded as a hoax letter to 25 schools being investigated and a counter-terrorism? I mean, have you ever heard of an escalation like that in this kind of space of time?
Well, it's bizarre, and one wonders how a national government could even countenance it. I mean, the connotations with terrorism couldn't be more serious, it seems to me. Whatever issues Birmingham City Council or any other city council or local education authority might have with schools and the conduct of governors, the fact of the matter is we have to understand that we're dealing here with children who are British-born, who have every right to feel a part of the community as everybody else, who may or may not have a position on Islam worldwide, but who ought not to be labeled, at least by implication, with this notion of being subjected to terrorism teaching, or as if they were all being trained to be jihadists.
Shabana, I mean, we discussed this in the first part of the programme, and really nobody could really provide an answer to this question. So I'm going to see maybe you're a bit nearer the centre of power, whether you can. How did we go from this? How did we get from one school, the Parkview Academy, to 25 schools, to a former head of counter-terrorism? How has that happened?
Well, I mean, as for the appointment of Peter Clarke, I've been very clear. I think this is a very provocative move by the Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove. I think it's hugely disappointed that he's decided to do this. And I just cannot believe that we had 10 MPs in Birmingham, across party political divides, a Conservative and Liberal Democrat MP join forces with us to write to Michael Gove and to plead with him to work with Birmingham City Council, have a joint process, advisor-led by an educationalist, to try and get to the bottom of what's happened. And instead, Birmingham City Council, because Michael Gove was doing nothing, appointed their own, Ian Kershaw, an educationalist, to look into all of these matters. And the very next day, Michael Gove goes and puts in Peter Clarke, who is very talented and skillful individual, I'm sure, but he has a counter-terrorism background. And that sends a terrible message to all of the communities in Birmingham and across the rest of the country as well. I think it's a deeply, deeply disappointing move. As for how the whole thing has mushroomed and grown in size, I think obviously once the first set of allegations made it into the media, most people are quite clear that that there are things in that original letter that are defamatory. But what's happened after that is, with all of the scrutiny, people have been making disclosures to Birmingham City Council, and some of those disclosures, and there's about 200 in total, some of them are very serious in nature. So the council has a responsibility, and I would support them in this, to try and get to the bottom of those allegations without taking a judgment one way or the other at this point, whether they are true or not. And what they really needed was some support from Michael Gove, and instead now Peter Clarke is going to rock up to Birmingham and and he's going to have a lot of work to do, because people are suddenly thinking we've gone from bullying and harassment allegations and some people trying to, maybe subvert potentially a non-denominational state school into a faith school, which is how I was reading some of the media reporting. We've gone from that to a potential terrorist link. I mean, that is very, very worrying. I don't think Michael Gove should have done this.
What do you make, just as a matter of interest, of the 200 complaints? I mean, Tim was referring to these earlier. Is there some kind of? Do you think there's a sort of, this bursts onto into the news, and there's a kind of element of kind of urban myth running here, or do you think there's a broader problem that does need investigating, or is this the purpose of the education to tell us this?
Well, I think the conversations I've had with the council suggested that clearly of the 200, not all of them are going to have substance. So there will be some that are maybe vexatious in nature, maybe, former employees of schools who've got an axe to grind. There will be an element of that. There are some which are at the less serious end of the scale, so where there's clearly possibly a bit of a misunderstanding about the way in which, elections to governing bodies work. And then there are others which are at the much more serious end. So the council knew that they've got to take everything seriously. They had to have a proper procedure to sort of weed out the ones that have no substance and then really home in on the things that are of greater concern. And that's why they were very clear from the start that they needed somebody else to come in with an independent view and have a look at these things. And that's the right process, I think. You need an educationalist, somebody who knows their way around the education system. The thing that's also very interesting is, of course, not all of the 25 schools are actually under the power of the local authority, the council themselves. So the majority of the schools that have made it into the papers, where there seem to be the greatest concerns, are actually academies. So they are under direct control from Michael Gove himself. That is who they answer to. So there's a real issue here as well about accountability. I mean, at the very least with the local authority, you've got an accountability structure, but the council are powerless really when it comes to academies. And that's why if you'd had a proper joint process working with Michael Gove and the Department for Education, we could have really learnt some lessons about school governance and school structures. But as it is, we're not going to get to that, I don't think. I mean,
Tim, you've been doing a valiant and embattled job of defending this appointment in the first half of the programme. But, I mean, there obviously, from what Shabana is saying, there was obviously an alternative route open to Michael Gove, which could have cooperated and could have dealt with the problem which you raised in the first half and Shabana's raised here, that not all these schools are local council responsibility in any case. So yes to working with the minister, but no to this way.
Well, I mean, there's always an alternative route, isn't there? This is a political decision made by the Secretary of State. It's a political appointment. This is his judgment. I would still say, let's not prejudge Peter Clarke's capabilities in this arena. He was the head of counter-terrorism. He isn't now. He isn't a police officer anymore. He's been appointed as an education commissioner. Let's see what he does, and then, then we can critique his efforts afterwards.
But with respect, Tim, that's not good enough. You can't separate the fact that he was in charge of counter-terrorism from what he's doing now. We are talking about Muslim schools. The charge is that there are governors wanting to introduce more extreme attitudes towards curriculum, towards school ethos, etc., etc., etc. And let's remember that this is not in isolation. I work in a university. Universities up and down the land have been required for God knows how long, as part of this prevent agenda, to spy on students, to monitor what's going on amongst Muslim students. So we're segueing now from higher education into schools, and the question is, where will it end? It is particularly significant that Peter Clarke was in charge of counterterrorism. You can't separate those things.
Well, let me just bring in Anis Kamani now, because is this? We trailed this part of the programme by saying that this looks as if it might be spreading to your part of the world up there in Bradford and in Manchester. What's your understanding about that?
Well, I think it's a modern-day witch hunt, and I think what it clearly shows, given that we've got elections coming up, is that when you are talking tough about Muslims, when you are scrutinising Muslims disproportionately, this wins votes. What we don't see is any equivalence in terms of other kinds of extremism. This is one of the things I've been saying for many, many years. Equally, the far-right extremism is something which is growing across the country, but we don't see that level of scrutiny at all. So clearly, this is something which wins votes. And it is quite shocking, the fact that you can have some quite vexatious kind of and slanderous kind of statements made, and we find that the media machine obviously thrives on that because it's a perfect storm for them, and then we find politicians jumping on board that. And I totally agree with what Gus is saying about the securitization of the public sector, and in particular the school sector. What we've seen is a securitization with teachers are being given the responsibility to actually identify people who are considered as extremists. And one of the things I find quite laughable is that what is the definition of an extremist that local authorities have? I've been actually saying this to a lot of counsellors and educationists at the moment. Have you got a formal definition of an Islamist that you're actually looking for? And so as a result of it, do you have a risk assessment framework that you're using within schools? The whole thing is quite laughable. And what's even worse is the fact that where's the accountability been? I think this is an important context that we have to put. For the last 30 years, black and ethnic minority children, including Muslim children, across the country have been systematically failed in the education system. For 30 years, children at Parkview School, in particular in Birmingham, have been coming out with 20 to 30% below the national average. What we have now with Parkview School is an outstanding school, which has clearly demonstrated strong school leadership. And now we have these quite vexatious kind of claims being made about it. So certainly I think it's a bit of a modern day witch hunt. I think a lot of these policies are institutionally Islamophobic, and they've been designed particularly because they're politicized policies which are there to actually target the Muslim community, because it's seen, if you talk tough about Muslims in the UK, if you ban Muslim groups, if you scrutinize Muslim organizations, this wins you votes. And it's actually far worse than that. There's a case recently of a school in Bradford which was applying for free school status. It's a Muslim faith school, and we had the head of the Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism coming to chair that particular panel. Now, what is the head of the Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism doing, chairing the panel of a school that's applying for free school status?
Just let me stop you there, Alex, because I want to put that point to some of the guests in the studio. I mean, Shaban, did you know that this is sort of spreading out beyond Birmingham now? Because I mean, this is yet another. This is a further escalation of it. It's not just about the complaints in Birmingham. Did you know that this seems to be moving to other parts?
Only from the media reports, and that's surprising to me that it is growing. And I wonder how much of that is because of the media scrutiny that we've seen and the spotlight being on this issue. As for Birmingham, I think it's not possible to say one way or the other exactly what is the nature of, or the truth, of the allegations that we've seen. Certainly, for example, in relation to Parkview School and others as well that have been in the newspapers, there have been parents who've come forward with concerns about things that were happening at those schools. So I don't think it's possible for us to be in a position where we can say, actually, this is vexatious. The whole of it is vexatious in nature. And that's why I've always come back to this point about having a fair process with an educationalist at the heart of it, just to try and get to the bottom of it. And if there is then something that is found to have greater substance, you can move on. I can't speak to the developments elsewhere in the country. I don't have any personal knowledge of them, I'm afraid.
Gus, do you think that one of the things that's happening here is the kind of the propaganda around it is, I was going to say mission creep, but creep indicates something that's moving quite slowly. This is moving very, very fast indeed. Because, I mean, as I remember, the initial reports were a kind of overemphasis on the use of the Quran and so forth in assemblies, and some question about the seating arrangements in classrooms being divided between boys and girls. Now, anybody who's come up to the British education system knows that the segregation of boys in schools is hardly something novel to the British education system. But do you understand that, because I struggle with this, how we've got from this to a story which even involves the words counter-terrorism? I mean, these things may be good, they may be bad, they may be pressure being brought that should be looked into, but this is the kind of stuff that goes on in schools all the time on a variety of different reasons.
You make a very good point. It goes on in schools all the time. Around this used to do with sex education, creationism, a whole range of things. And people adopt positions, whether they be Christian or not, which are sometimes very, very extreme. The danger in all of this is that I mean, I'm old enough to remember to have been part of campaigns in the 1960s when we took to the streets and campaigned against boroughs busing black children from their immediate neighborhoods and dispersing them all over the place where there weren't as many black kids. The reason for that is that the government had decided if you have more than 30% of black children in the school, then it's likely to interfere with, damage, contaminate the educational attainment of white children. Blatantly racist. It wouldn't surprise me if tomorrow Michael Gove were to say, one way of dealing with this is to let's bust all of these Muslim children. Let's not have a concentration of them in this school or that, so that we could better control what they do and who does what with them. That's the danger of it. And you see, I come back to my original point. You cannot label children in those ways, or for that matter suggest that they're so supine and have got no power themselves, so that they would simply be passive recipients of other people's extremism. And what it points up, in my view, is the sheer lunacy of having a state education system that is privatized and truncated and divided in the way that Michael Gove wants us to have. That's the issue. A lack of local accountability. The Secretary of State, him or herself, having to determine how to make governing bodies of academies or advisory groups or whatever they're called accountable directly to the Secretary of State rather than to elected people. This, I believe, is the tip of the iceberg where this whole business about a democratic deficit and democratic accountability is concerned.
I mean, well, Tim, you raised that point originally in the first half of the programme, saying, you know, that in a way there almost has to be a commissioner because these schools aren't responsible to the local authority. Do you think that this is an example of the kind of, you know, sort of privatisation of the education system, or parts of it, to use that phrase, coming back and biting the Tories? You know, they've said parent choice, parent choice, parent choice, and they get the kind of parents making the kind of choices they don't really like.
Well, yes, I mean, you could make that argument, but, you know, equally, you know, what Michael Gove has done is continue this academy programme that was actually started up and initiated by the previous government. So
but it's very different in nature now to what it was under us. Let me be very clear.
I'll give you that moment in just a second, but Tim, finish your point.
Well, maybe, but you know, to empower parents, I think is a good thing. To depoliticise the education system by removing the involvement of political local authorities, I think is a good thing. I accept the fact that, you know, these governance structures are probably underdeveloped at the moment, you know, and this will make up an increasing programme of reform in the future. But to write the whole thing off and rip it up and say this is a failure is completely the wrong approach. There are, you know, people with an ideological objection to parents having control over schools and setting the agenda for education. I accept that, but you know, let's not conflate these issues and use that as a way of trying to get rid of these reforms.
Okay, Shobhana, so I mean, you have that moment where you say, no, we didn't realise it was going to get up and wander around and behave like this when we started it.
No.
But at the same time, isn't what's happening? I mean, Tim says it depoliticised the thing, but actually it isn't. What happened is that it took it away from a no doubt flawed but democratic political sphere and has placed it in a sphere where the parents are political but the Tories don't like it.
Well, it's more political than that because actually it's completely centralised because they all answer to Michael Gove. So it couldn't be more politicised, actually. At least at a local council level, you have a number of parties represented. It's got to go through the formal council structures regardless of who's in power. So just for the record, under the last Labour government, the Academies programme was brought in to help schools that were failing and where all other attempts to turn them around had not succeeded. So it was a very limited programme programme and focused only on the very worst schools that were doing wrong by their kids and were failing their kids. And that's what the Academies programme under us was all about. We do not agree with this free school, free-for-all, where the schools can be opened up almost anywhere with no thought given to whether that is where places are most needed. Yesterday brought into sharp focus the primary school places crisis that we've got in this country, and that's happening because actually local authorities no longer have a role in planning for where they know that the places will be most needed. And so you've got free schools and resources for free schools being spent in areas of high need and areas where there is great pressure on places not getting the schools that they need. So that's the real problem with Michael Gove's so-called reforms of the education system.
Well, let me put some of those points to Alice. Alice, I mean, I guess Shabana's point, if I be allowed to summarise it, is it was a small and kind of final sort of case scenario under Labour, but rather like Topsy, it's just growed under the Tories, but it's not as pretty as Topsy. Is that your take on it?
Well, I think if I go back to one of the points, there was a recognition that certain schools were systematically failing and that there was a need to look at some other kinds of interventions with them. So I can understand and appreciate that particular point. And now, yes, what the beast it's become is something which has gone away from that particular origins. But I want to go back to that point as well. What we seem to be having is that where Muslim parents and black parents as well seem to hold schools to account, become empowered and are able to effectively challenge school leadership, head teachers who have been in post for 20, 30 years sometimes, challenge them for their performance using legitimate instruments such as the Education Act, such as the Equality Act, okay, and demanding, obviously, that, attainment levels be improved, then this has become an interesting new stick with which to hit them. We've had this in a couple of schools in Bradford as well, where parents, okay, have used their legitimate rights, okay, to challenge school authorities, and what we're finding is that they're being labelled as extremists. And it's not just in the education sector as well. It's happening quite extensively in the charitable sector as well. We've got many, many Muslim charities which are having a level of scrutiny that nobody else is having in Britain at the moment. Now, anyone who's been involved in any kind of work around counterterrorism and radicalization knows that the way you radicalize a whole generation or a whole group of people is by disproportionate treatment, which creates legitimate grievance. And then when they express that legitimate grievance and then you problematize them, which is what we're doing, then you ideologize them even more. You actually send them much more towards an extremist kind of narrative.
OK, I'm going to have to stop you there, Alice, because that's a good point to end on. As I said earlier, when we first started reporting on this story, it was a story about one school in Birmingham. Now it's a story about 25 schools in Birmingham and schools in Bradford and schools in Manchester and the Secretary of State for Education and a counter-terrorism officer. But I have a feeling that we'll be returning to this issue in future editions of Analysis. Please join us.